Greetings all. This is Preethi S from the Department of English, Kristu Jayanti College. Today we shall look into a very interesting short story called The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. This is one of Chopin's most popular and celebrated works, and it still looks into a very pertinent theme, which is of gender and its importance in society and how it continues to play a vital role in how we govern ourselves. So today we will quickly look into the short story. This was published in 1894, but much of its themes, as I've mentioned earlier, is relevant even today. So a quick dive into who was Kate Chopin. Chopin was an American short story writer and novelist. She was very popular, especially for her short stories, which she essentially took up as a way of providing for her family. She was married at the age of 20 in a very conservative Orthodox American South, and sadly she lost her husband at a very young age. Now this put her in a very difficult position because back in the day it was not easy for a woman to find a job, and she had started writing and she found that she was quite passionate in fact about writing, and she discovered that through writing she could earn a living for herself, and through her writings, through her short stories, she managed to provide for her 6 children. Now this goes on to become one of the foundation in a lot of her short stories, which is the need for women to find financial freedom. And she found this as a source of inspiration from her own mother, her aunt and great-grandmother as well, who all went on to live a very unconventional life as widows. And in many of her short stories, you find this theme running through of women that refuse to be bracketed into gender norms, especially one which is assigned due to marriage. And of course, that has evolved, but definitely in 1800s Southern America, this was a very restrictive, limiting space. So in a lot of novels, in a lot of her short stories, you will find women that are constantly in this pushed into a feeling of being cloistered, claustrophobic, and all of it because of the very limitations of marriage. So the short story we will dive into today, which is Story of an Hour, also has a very pertinent theme of marriage and how marriage can define and also limit the identities of women. Now, one of her most celebrated works called The Awakening, which was published in 1899 when she was around 50 years of age, it was a very controversial text because it dived into very bold themes of breaking gender norms, of bodily autonomy, and all of this, especially in a very conservative Orthodox Southern America, was not met with a sense of ease. And in fact, she was pushed into a sense of obscurity after that because she was seen as rejecting what is expected to be or what is expected out of a woman, especially in the 1800s. It is only much later on in the 1950s that this renowned work, received its due recognition. And today, of course, Kate Chopin goes down in literary history as one of the greatest short story writers, one with a deep sense of empathy and a deep sense of understanding and awareness about the very dangerous form of stereotypical understanding of gender and how it can impact the lives of countless women. So today, of course, the work such as The Awakening, which back in the day was scorned upon, which was pushed aside, today it is a deeply renowned and celebrated work. Now we'll quickly dive into our short story today, which is The Story of an Hour. It's again a well-known, widely translated short story, and it continues to marvel readers across cultures, across times, even today. The story is relatively simple. It is about a young wife called Louise Mallard, who is informed to us that suffers from a very tragic ailment, which is a heart condition. So from the very beginning, it is informed to us that she is both physically and emotionally vulnerable, to whom any form of important, tragic, or shocking news should be delivered with utmost care. And the story begins with a sense of shock where the news of her husband's passing is informed to her. Now, of course, it proceeds in a very traditional, typical manner where she isolates herself from the family and she finds comfort in the solace of her room, where she mourns for the loss of her husband and also recognizes that her life has completely changed. She's pushed into the sense of ambiguity, in the sense of incompleteness, and she has absolutely no idea where her life is to take her from there on. And this is so far the very traditional reading of a mourning wife. But within a matter of 10-15 minutes, slowly a certain emotion that she has never experienced starts to surface. An emotion that was very passionate, very pertinent, and refused to leave her side. And at first, even the readers are sent into the sense of unawareness as to what this emotion could be. And later, we realize it's a form of absolute happiness, absolute jubilance for the sense of freedom that she has never experienced in her entire life. And there's this passionate yearning to experience more of this freedom. And so it of course takes a very unconventional turn, as much of Chopin's female characters do, who oftentimes reject gender tropes, gender norms, and we meet one such character here as well. So we'll dive into the analysis quickly. First of all, this is essentially a short story that dives into the importance of identity. Now, 1800s America and much of Europe and much of the world culture as well, women's position was oftentimes tied or tethered to that of her husband. Both her physical, cultural, socio-political aspects were all defined by her relation to her husband. She had very little say, very little understanding, very little choices that were granted to her. And so much of her world was defined by the boundary that her husband had laid down for her. And that is why here we meet Mrs. Mallard, who very interestingly, this lack of identity is proven by the name that is assigned to her, Mrs. Mallard. She is only a mere extension of her husband, Mr. Bentley Mallard. But as this feeling of happiness, as this feeling of freedom starts to seep in, she slowly starts to accept a new identity, which is Louise Mallard, or rather simply Louise, an identity that from here on would be her own, days that would be her own. But finally, at the end, we realize that all of these were only a facade, because we realize that there was a miscommunication and Mr. Bentley Mallard returned safely, fortunately, of course. But sadly, to Mrs. Mallard, this was a terrible shock, and she's once again reduced to the identity of wife. Right? And this essential emotional journey that she takes goes on to prove how truly vulnerable and how truly short-lived the lives of many women were, especially within the restrictive space of marriage in the 1900s. Right? Now we'll do one thing, we'll explore the literary devices of the short story. Now, one of the main devices that is used is, of course, symbolism. And it's very beautifully echoed across in the short story. You have wonderful representations of the open window, the spring and summer days, the smell of rain in the air, the wide open, empty blue sky, the chirping of the birds, a distant song in the sky. All of these are experiences that Mrs. Mallard is pushed into right after she learns of her husband's passing. And it's all a form of juxtaposition. It's a very morbid contradiction, in fact. Here is a woman that you expect to be terribly pushed into a sense of isolation, into a sense of mourning. But instead, here is she who experiences all the symbols of jubilance, of love, of glory, of peace, of freedom, and all these forms of possibilities that essentially shower down upon her. And so all of these essentially symbolize her very pertinent yearning for freedom. And essentially, this was a yearning that was deeply sowed within her for a long time. And the next, of course, another aspect or literary device that you can highlight is irony or dramatic irony. Right? It's truly ironic. It's, of course, a very form of dark irony that here is a woman that refuses to feel an ounce of pity, an ounce of fear or sadness, but instead is pushed into the sense of absolute joy. Right? But please don't mistake her to be a villainous character. Understand that back in the day, for a woman of her position, this was the only moment of freedom. This was the only moment where she was her true, authentic self. And that's a very important aspect to recognize. So do not read Mrs. Mallard from the perspective of today's 21st century perspective, because if so, it's very easy for us to vilify her. Understand her from the perspective of 1800s America. In fact, in many states in America in the 1800s, women were seen as legal properties of men. And that is where the sense of freedom, the sense of yearning comes through. And of course, themes, as we've discussed, we can quickly go through gender politics, as much of the themes explored in Chopin's works is about the power play that is usually levied for men in such positions of power within marriage. Marriage essentially becomes a very beneficial institution for men. And of course, that has evolved today. It is, of course, a short story that dives into the theme of freedom and selfhood. This is the first time that Mrs. Mallard recognizes her true self. She asserts herself by reclaiming her future, by reclaiming her present, and by forgetting her past. It's a process of awakening. It's a process of awakening into a new future, awakening into a new self, and forgetting who she was, a self that was defined by society, defined by her husband, defined by marriage. It no longer has any such restrictions. And so awakening becomes a very empowering moment in the text. But it also dives into the dangers of repression. You see, the final tragic end of Mrs. Mallard is one that truly plays out the terrible identity, or rather the terrible positioning of many such women who for years go forth in their marriage unaware of their sense of unhappiness, unaware of their sense of dissatisfaction. And that is precisely what happened to Mrs. Mallard as well. She had repressed herself, repressed her sense of identity, her sense of happiness, joy. All of it was essentially a facade, a pretense, a mask of sorts. That essentially what society expects. But finally, at the end, when Mr. Brentley Mallard returns and she realizes she has to go back to playing this role once again, all these emotions come bubbling forth, and it is too difficult and too strong for her to bear anymore. So it shows the dangers of repression, how it can consume you, how it can completely alter you. Right? And of course, this is a text that dives into the theme of marriage. It's a social control, in an institution that is extremely restrictive to women, especially in the 1800s. So the title, earlier it was in fact The Dream of an Hour, but Chopin changed it to The Story of an Hour, because the dream essentially looks into how it was only an illusion. Similarly, the title could also look into that for an entire hour, that was the only time in which she lived for herself. Her entire story is contained within an hour, and that is truly tragic. That her entire life she went forth unknowing who she was, what is it that she aspired, who was she, her past, her present, her future. All of it she was only able to recognize in the duration of that 1 hour. So in one sense, it becomes a bittersweet ending of sorts, that at least she lived that 1 hour for herself. You have similar short stories, similar works that have themes of marriage, of gender, and of the restrictions of gender tropes and stereotypes. You have very important works by Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar. You have A Doll's House. All of these dive into, again, the examination of the very maddening and restrictive spaces of how gender norms, gender dynamics can truly push one into a sense of obscurity, into a sense of incompleteness. And so these are few themes, these are few texts that you can also explore and compare along with The Story of an Hour. The Story of an Hour, though written in 1800s America, it still holds true today. It holds true today because even today you have spaces where very patriarchal structures go on to limit and mar the identities of women. Not just women, but even men. So it essentially dives into how gender truly can be very limiting. And so this is a short story that looks into how we need to essentially allow for a more fluid understanding